Let's flip to the other side. When Notre Dame has the ball, just as it was for Texas, Oregon in the second game, Tennessee, everybody this year, it's going to be extremely tough for Notre Dame to score on this Ohio State defense.
Mm-hmm.
They are going to have to be flawless. They're not going to they can't have any turnovers, very few penalties, which has plagued them a lot in the playoffs,
Yeah.
especially in that Georgia game. You talked about running the ball. Notre Dame's only averaged 4 yards per carry in the playoffs on the ground. And I know that can be attributed to some injuries on the offensive line and, kind of a step up in competition, obviously, from who they played in the regular season. I mean, obviously, competition gets tougher in the playoffs, but can the O line get any push at all? I think they're going to have to try to get off tackle a little bit, but they better have somebody ready for that second level of that defense because Cody Simon and Sonny Styles are going to be waiting, and not to mention Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs just coming downhill to try to punish those running backs.
I don't know that I've ever seen, seriously, I'm not trying to be prisoner of the moment. I don't know that I've ever seen, when you watch a game, you see a pair of safeties that just absolutely flash into the screen and pop somebody at the line of, really at the line of scrimmage or right when they cross the line of scrimmage. The way that Ransom and Downs just diagnose plays, and as smart as they are, obviously they're really good in coverage too, but dude, they're ridiculous in the run game.
It definitely shows to the fact that I would think those guys, and really a lot of players, but those two guys specifically, I think they study film a ton. I mean, Caleb Downs talked about that toss sweep that Texas ran, and he said that Georgia tried to do that same thing to Alabama last year in the SEC championship game, and that's how he diagnosed it, and that's how he knew it was coming, and that's how he attacked it so fiercely.
Yeah, he literally he told Andy Staples in On 3 that but right before the play, he knew exactly what they were about to do. And it showed, obviously, on that toss sweep. Yeah, it's a good call there, man. So I talked about after the Tennessee game, after Ohio State blasted Tennessee and Columbus, we going into that Oregon game, I talked about that, the offensive explosion that they had against Tennessee, that might not be able to be replicated. Well, of course, they ended up doing it again to Oregon. But what can be replicated is how good they're playing on defense, how dominant they were up front, especially the defensive line, how dominant they were at the line of scrimmage on defense. They replicated that against Oregon. After the Oregon game, talked about it again, going into the Texas game. What could be replicated? Said the defense could, not sure the offense could. Obviously, the defense was again. That they replicated it again. Dude, I've got some numbers here that are just insane with this Ohio State defense here in the playoffs. So just some numbers here. They've had 28 tackles for a loss and 16 sacks in 3 college football playoff games so far. So what's interesting about that is the Buckeyes had 2.9 sacks per game in the regular season. In the playoffs, they're averaging 5.3 sacks per game. That's obviously huge. And really, JTT and Jack Sawyer have been just a dynamic duo there. Again, JTT had 5.5 sacks. He's had 5.5 sacks in the college football playoffs so far. He had 6 sacks the entire regular season. Jack Sawyer has 4.5 sacks in this playoffs. He had 4.5 sacks the entire regular season. See a theme here? So they averaged about 8.5. They averaged about 8 tackles for a loss in the regular season, and they're averaging around 10 tackles for a loss so far in this playoff. So the theme here is JTT and Jack Sawyer and that defensive line is wreaking havoc behind the line of scrimmage. They're killing teams with getting you behind the chains and getting you in second and long. And this defense is too good on the back end and too good up front for you to play behind the chains. I mean, no offense is going to be really successful playing behind the chains, but Notre Dame especially, the way that they play, dude, they can't play behind the chain. They just can't. They can't be sitting there. Like in the first half against Penn State, that seemed like what Notre Dame was doing almost every drive. They were giving up tackles for a loss, a sack, something where they were playing behind the chains. They have to win that battle, or at least hold their own. I'm not sure you can win that battle against this Buckeye defensive front, but you've got to be able to hold your own against it. It can't be Buckeyes have 8+ tackles for a loss and 4+ sacks in this game. That can't happen for Notre Dame to have success on offense. And more importantly, I went back and looked. So obviously the Buckeyes have looked pretty much unstoppable in this playoff. They've had 2 losses this year. Oregon and Michigan. I tried to look and see like what was a parallel between those two games because obviously Oregon plays a completely different style of football than Michigan does. There was one theme in that game, in both of those games, in both of those losses, and it has to do with what I was just talking about in regards to tackles for a loss and sacks. Ohio State in their two losses to Oregon and Michigan, they had a combined 0 sacks in those two games, and they only had 2.5 tackles for a loss combined in those two games. Again, they've had 28 tackles for loss and 16 sacks in these 3 college football playoff games. So, if you're looking for a recipe to possibly get a win against this Buckeye bunch that looks borderline unstoppable right now, you've got to be able to prevent them from getting in the backfield and wreaking havoc in the backfield and getting tackles for losses and tackles for a loss and sacks. But easier said than done against this bunch.
Yeah, I mean, on Notre Dame's side, I mean, it's no secret that their passing game is not the strongest. I mean, last game against Penn State was the first game all season that Notre Dame had a 100-yard receiver. So the Ohio State defense we've seen it be susceptible to some deep shots, especially in that first Oregon game.
Yeah.
Notre Dame's going to have to take them without a doubt. They did that in the second half of the Penn State game. They took some, sluggos, some wheel routes, all that stuff. They've got to do that. They have to test Igbinosun on one side because he's similar to Christian Gray on Notre Dame's defensive backfield. He tends to get a little handsy. He's got a lot of penalties called on him this year.
Pretty physical.
A lot of pass interference. So you've got to test that defense as much as you can. You're not always going to succeed, like you just said. You're not always going to win those battles, but they have to know and they have to respect that a deep shot is at least coming. And if and when you get into the red zone, when you're Notre Dame, don't call it toss sweeps. That's just, I mean, and I know it's easier said than done to try to score on the number 1 red zone scoring defense in the country, which is Ohio State. But I know Notre Dame's not going to do that. Everybody knows what they're going to do. And for 3, probably 4 plays, they're going to run Riley Leonard right up the gut 4 times, and they're going to try to punch it in.
Yep.
That's just what they're going to do if and when they get down to the red zone. So,
something else I'm wondering what you think here. I mean, the Buckeyes look like that they had never, ever seen somebody throw the ball to the back out of the backfield against Texas. Like, Texas could not, just like in the Oregon game, Oregon for the majority of that game, it seemed like that there was not a single wide receiver that could freaking get open. Texas at one point in that second half, it's like, is there a wide receiver ever going to catch a pass for Texas in the second half? And then out of nowhere, like the back out of the backfield was just open a lot. So, I mean, obviously that's something that I'm sure that Jim Knowles and that bunch is going to be working on this week, because you got to imagine Notre Dame's going to attempt to do it. And if I'm not mistaken, didn't that first drive in the second half, Aeneas Williams?
Yeah, Aeneas Williams. I mean, I think he had 4 or 5 catches in the game, but he had that sluggo route.
He's a freshman, isn't he?
Yeah, true freshman. So, yeah, it's gonna be an interesting matchup on that side of the ball. Overall, as a whole, man, 2 of the best cultures in college football.
Yeah,
what Marcus Freeman has created in just 3 years, I think, in my opinion, it's set Notre Dame up for success for as long as he is the head coach there. And I've said this on other shows. I believe they're one of the best positioned teams in the country with this new NIL and transfer portal era. They don't see a lot of guys transfer out because the guys that go to Notre Dame to play football, they also care a lot about the academics that Notre Dame provides, and you can't find that at other schools. Ohio State, Ryan Day has created this culture of toughness at Ohio State, and mostly mental toughness, in my opinion. I mean, he's tried to be tough really ever since that Notre Dame game last year where Lou Holtz called him out and he wasn't tough, right? But the mental toughness that this team has had to have to drown out the outside noise, especially after that Michigan game, even the noise from their own fan base, right? That Kirk Herbstreit's talked about, the lunatic fringe and all that, and just focus on the voices of that locker room. These 2 teams, they have some of the best cultures in college football.
Absolutely, man. And like, you think about it too. I know Ohio State fans listen to this. Like, the last thing they want anybody to do is bring up Michigan. But like, I think they would even admit, like, the last 2 to 3 years, Michigan kind of had a blueprint there of keeping guys in the program, being like a veteran group having a good culture within the locker room between the players, like the players themselves. I'm not talking about the Connor Stallions crap and all that other stuff. I'm talking about just the players in the locker room, player-led team type stuff. That's what Michigan had, and they won a national championship last year, and they were built on toughness. Ohio State had a bunch of dudes that came back that could have went pro, and the culture between, and like you just talked about, in that locker room with those players themselves in general, like they had to look themselves in the mirror, man, after that Michigan game and decide how they wanted to be remembered. And they did not want that game against Michigan being their lasting memory. Absolutely not. And yeah, the culture, the veteran group that they've got mixed in with a couple of obviously key transfers like Downs and like true freshman Jeremiah Smith. I mean, that's the blueprint, man. And you're right with Notre Dame, dude. Like, what's the guy that gave that passionate speech, the God, country, and mother effing Notre Dame before they played Georgia?
Pat Coogan.
Pat Coogan. Like, he talked about, like, this is our culture versus their culture. Like, that's what this game comes down to against Georgia in that game. And it's obvious that, like, culture is the number one. I'm going to say number one. It's the number one thing. I know everybody talks about it, man. But, like, talking about it and then going out and being about it and showing it to the rest of the country like Notre Dame has done and like Ohio State has done in this playoff, that's a completely different deal. You're onto something there, man, with Notre Dame in regards to, like, they're not going to be a team that's going to be portal heavy. And the types of dudes that they're going to continue to bring in, like a Riley Leonard, is going to be guys that have that certain type of mentality about them that fits the culture at Notre Dame. And like, we've seen it, man, like in the day and time of college football where teams don't have tons of depth anymore because of the transfer portal. I mean, Notre Dame has had, I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of injuries that they've had. And I know the Buckeyes have had some key injuries on the offensive line, for sure. But Notre Dame's had injuries at every freaking position group throughout this entire year. It's unbelievable, especially in this playoff. And they continue to find ways to win. Why is that? Culture. That's why. And so in this game, that culture is going to have to show up in a big way because this is the most talented roster. I don't even think it's even a mouthful to say this at this point. I said it earlier a few weeks ago, and it may have seemed hot take-ish, but I don't think it does anymore. Ohio State has the most talented roster that we've seen as far as talent across the board in college football since the 2019 LSU team. That's what they're a different type of team than that 2019 LSU team. I'm just talking about pure talent across the board at every position group on defense and the wide receivers that you've got for the Buckeyes and the two tailbacks. I mean, they're the most talented team by far. So Notre Dame's culture is going to have to win them this game.